Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, you'll find out why it seems like every comedian has a podcast. If you wanted to become a professional stand-up comedian in the 1990s, the path was pretty straightforward. You started by going to amateur open mic nights where you would hone your act. Eventually, you'd develop 5 to 10 minutes of solid material and maybe get a slot opening for a bigger comedian. From there, you'd work yourself up to bigger and bigger gigs, and if you were really talented and lucky, you'd land a slot on a late-night talk show, or, even better, get signed to an hour-long special for HBO. These days, the path for the aspiring comedian is completely different. Sure, there's still the open mic nights and the club gigs, but there's also a bevy of online platforms that you can leverage to sharpen your craft and build a following. You might collaborate with other comedians and write sketches for a YouTube channel. You can practice your one-liners on Twitter, and you'll definitely want to launch a podcast. As a full-time stand-up comedian, Joel Byars has employed several of these strategies. I interviewed Byars about how comedians market themselves in this golden age of stand-up comedy and asked him why he decided to self-produce his own comedy special. Before we jump to the interview, I want to talk about the value this podcast creates. To date, I've produced 73 episodes. That's 73 interviews with the leading practitioners in online content. I've given you an inside look into the New York Times video strategy, Slate's live events operations, Quartz newsletter business, and BuzzFeed's travel vertical. I've interviewed some of the world's most successful magazine journalists, podcast hosts, and video creators. If that kind of value isn't worth paying for, then I don't know what is. There's only one way that I make money from this podcast and all the content I create for you, through paying subscribers. To help fund my journalism, go to simonowens.substack.com. Signing up gets you tons of newsletters each month that are packed with the kinds of insights you've come to expect from me. Don't just assume someone else will pay. I'm entirely reliant on you. Go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Okay, on to my interview with Joel. Hey Joel, thanks for joining us.
Simon, thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of the show.
So you're a stand-up comic. First, let's start with, how did you get your start in stand-up comedy?
Well, I started at open mics, really just performing at any bar / sidewalk / public bus, really anywhere where there's a captive or uncaptive audience. I was willing to tell jokes.
And it's that kind of cringy atmosphere that's sometimes depicted in movies where you really suck at first. You go up, you bomb, then you go up and you bomb a little less, and you gradually just become dead inside as you're waiting to basically, until you can finally start getting some traction. Is that a fair assumption?
That is the fair reality of comedy. And you forgot to mention you're sitting at these terrible shows for up to 3 hours before you get your 5 minutes of depression. So it's not for the faint of heart, but that's why I love it, because it's so difficult, but it's so measurable in terms of seeing your progress.
That's got to be a pretty good culling experience to get a lot of the competition out of the way pretty early, is the people who can basically bomb over and over again and still keep on going.
Exactly. And I've been doing this for 10 years now, so I have seen waves of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed people, especially comedy is booming right now, and everyone's seeing all these comedy specials and thinking they can do stand-up, and then they get on stage and are like, oh, this is hard.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So we'll definitely get into that and talking about the media effect on the comedy scene. First, I want to talk a little bit about a podcast you run, and then get into the motivations behind that. Tell me about your podcast. It's been running for a while now. How did you end up launching it?
Yeah, it's called Hot Breath. I've been doing it for around 4 years now, and it really was just the show I wish existed when I started in comedy, where it's like professional comedians sharing all their secret tips and tricks to how they became successful. And it's now grown into over 200 episodes, and people call it inside the actor studio for comedians.
Yeah, and it's basically you have on a comedian, but you guys talk shop. It's not necessarily two comedians just getting on and just wanting to be funny and talk about the day's events or whatever. It's really kind of a comedian's comedian podcast, right?
Yeah, and I was intentional about that because I was listening to other comedians' podcasts, and I started to get annoyed with every comedian was just creating a podcast to try to out funny their comedy friends. So I really wanted to create a podcast that not only comedians could learn from, that also comedy fans could kind of get a peek behind the curtain of what really goes on in comedy.
And you've had some big guests on, right?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest has been Cedric the Entertainer. But I mean, if you're in the comedy world, we've had, I mean, I'd say every guest almost is really in like that top tier of comedy.
And so, like one of the things I want to talk about in this is this kind of trend that like is almost become kind of a joke. Is that it seems like every single comedian has a podcast. Can you
Hmm.
talk a little bit about that trend? Like, is that a real thing? And what are the motivations behind that?
Yeah, comedians I think are seeing, well, one, you know, Joe Rogan has inspired so many people to start a podcast, but especially him being a comedian, and he's inspired so many of his friends to start like podcasts in the comedy world, and comedians are starting to see the success of these other comedians, and now they're thinking, oh, maybe I can get into this game. And it really is, I'm sure, as you know, doing a podcast, it's an extremely powerful marketing tool. So a lot of comedians are selling out clubs and theaters now, primarily driven just through the fan base they've built on their podcast.
And it's not just Joe Rogan. You think like Chris Hardwick and Mark Maron
Hmm.
also being good examples of comedians who were kind of their careers were kind of in the gutter. Mark Maron, both of them had substance abuse issues. Really, they weren't really. It seemed like the best years were behind them. They started a podcast. They reached a hardcore audience, and now they're A or B list celebrities, basically. So it really these kind of famous examples became kind of a framework for how a comedian could build up an audience, someone who is just addicted to listening to their voice and then taking that and transferring it to other things. So like they both, all these big comedians like that have these podcasts, I'm guessing that they regularly sell out comedy clubs. It gets them TV deals in terms of just acting on TV shows. Chris Hardwick is now a famous game show host. Like it seems like that is the hope that it'll open doors, right?
That's exactly what it is. And people are seeing, yeah, that the template has been set with the comedians, like you mentioned. And at any level, even at my level, you know, last year I went on a 2 week tour and it was booked by listeners. Like I told my listeners I was wanting to go on tour and asked them if they knew of any bookers or if they ran shows and things like that. And then a few months later, I actually have a 2 week tour booked all by the podcast. So there's so many different opportunities I have found from listeners and then also just people wanting to collaborate. And I've gotten more opportunities from the podcast than I could have ever imagined. It really started out with me just creating a show that I wish existed and how I can stand out. As you mentioned, so many comics having a podcast. I think that's important, you know, with any entrepreneur is like, okay, there's a lot of noise in this space, but how can I differentiate myself? How can I stand out? And a lot of that was instead of me trying to out funny my friends, but never mind, let me do well researched, well thought out interviews with comedians sharing that side of comedy that no one really gets access to until now.
And it's not just that comedians have their own podcasts, but a lot of them go on each other's podcasts. So is it kind of like is the idea to cross pollinate each other's audience? Like some comedian goes on your show, they have a large online following, so when when your episode with them goes live, they then share it to their social networks and vice versa. Like it kind of reminds me of the YouTube space where a lot of YouTubers collaborate with each other and kind of share each other's audiences. Do you see that kind of going on with comedians in the podcast space?
For sure, it's happening. And there's even networks now of like all comedy podcasts. And that was a big part of my big marketing push. I just released a comedy special called The Trophy Husband. And like my number one motivation in terms of marketing was like how many different comedian podcasts can I get on? How many to really start to spread that voice, because it's such an intimate connection you have with your audience via podcast to where they really feel like they know you and they're invested in you. So the more you can do that with people with similar audiences to you, just the more your audiences will grow.
And how do these networks work? I know there's one like Earwolf or something. Like, are they like a
Hmm.
loose confederation of podcasts, or are they like owned by the network itself? Like, how do these usually work?
From my understanding, it's like an ad revenue share where everyone's underneath the same umbrella of this network, and then they all just have kind of sponsors that they just plug in. Like every show has like the sponsors delegated by the network, and they just all plug them in and get ad revenue shares that way. But I'm not. I haven't. I've been approached by one, but I like having full ownership of everything I do. That's as I've gotten, 10 years into this game, I've started to understand the value of having full ownership. So that's something I've taken the long road on this, but I know the long road is harder, but it takes you farther.
So I've heard, various comedians claim that we're in what they're calling a second comedy boom. I guess the first one happened maybe like the 80s and early 90s. It basically, I guess, I don't know if it was the rise of like HBO specials or what, but there was just this trend where everybody was getting into stand-up comedy. And then that bubble kind of popped and the floor fell out. But then starting somewhere in like 2009, now there's like a new comedy boom, especially with stand-up comedy. Do you think that's true? And like, what role do you think that the internet plays in that boom?
Yeah, I think it's definitely booming. And I think the internet is the reason for that. I think people have more access than ever to the talent, like to comedians. It used to just be kind of like they were these celebrities you saw from afar and you would only see them on stage. But now people are getting an all access pass to entertainers, especially comedy, it being such a personal art form, a more like storytelling art form in terms of you really feel like you know that person. So the internet giving you the all access pass, I think makes people more invested in the person and more willing to like travel to go pay to see them and
And,
things
and
like
is
that.
the reason that they can scale up their audience and fan base like so much quicker? Like before, they had to just go to club after club after club and get slightly longer and longer sets until finally people started to know who they were. Whereas now, like a lot of that work can now be done on the internet in between the different sets.
For sure. And the power used to be held in the booker's hands and the club owner's hands. They were known as the gatekeepers. But now, with how we are, with having direct access to our audience, the power is actually in the comedian's hands
Uh-huh.
now.
And what, how do you see that manifested? Like in the sense of like, is it improve your bargaining position when you're like negotiating rates, or is it just like, how does the power, how do you feel that power?
Yeah, for sure. You have complete leverage in everything. So, especially there's these people known as like, quote, internet comedians as well, to where they're bringing in like these millions of followers to these different TV shows or to these different venues. And they have all the leverage in terms of they set the terms, the payment, all the expectations, probably even have creative control as well. And it all is all due to the fact of the influence you have online. So there's no real gatekeeper anymore. There's no real one set way. I think the internet has really made the entertainment landscape the Wild West again. So it's kind of figuring out getting in where you fit in.
And so I'd like to maybe go through some different platforms and the role that they're playing in this comedy boom. Like the first one I'd like to talk about is just Twitter. I feel like it has elevated
Mm-hmm.
some huge comics, like Rob Delaney is a good example. And I see a lot of
Mm-hmm.
comics using it as kind of for like kind of like one-liner jokes and trying to use basically this very confined space of only 280 characters to construct a scenario or a joke or something and riff off of current events and stuff like that. Is that do you see that yourself?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I have friends who have actually booked work just from people seeing their tweets and things like that. And it's interesting. You even see accounts like a Wendy's account, or I think Moon Pie is another example where they're actually using humor within their marketing. And you see so many companies starting to incorporate humor into their marketing because it really is the most effective way to connect with an audience. Is that humor, comedy creates a connection, which is all a business wants to do. So as a comedian, we have jokes tumbling through our heads all day every day, and Twitter just gives us a platform and an easily accessible way to do that if that's how you work. Like me, for instance, like I'm not really that active on Twitter. It's something that was never intuitive to me. I don't really walk around thinking in these quick snappy jokes, but the comedians that do have been able to take full advantage of Twitter, which has really become a big power of influence and another great way to build
Seems like
your
a
audience.
way to get really instant feedback as well, because I think of my biggest tweets in terms of number of retweets, and almost all of them were retweeted within the first few minutes after by some large account within the first few minutes after me tweeting them. So you get to see almost kind of like a real time audience reaction to whatever you tweet out.
Yeah, and I know friends who have done something on Twitter and it did really well, so they took it to the stage.
Yeah.
So it can also be kind of a sounding board for your writing.
Another big platform that I want to talk about is YouTube. I feel like there are a lot of comedians I've noticed who are uploading short clips to their YouTube channels. Like they'll actually have someone go to a comedy club and like tape their entire set. Maybe it's like a half an hour long or whatever it is. And then they'll kind of like break it down into different clips that are thematically grouped around different kinds of jokes. Like what is that a real trend? Have you tried that? What is the kind of motivation behind that?
Yeah, that is a huge, huge trend right now. And a big comedian responsible for it, his name's Andrew Schultz. And he filmed his own special, tried to sell it to different platforms and networks. No one would buy it. So he released it online on his YouTube. And then now it's just taken off like wildfire. And he looked at comedy like in the music world, they would just post like hit singles. So instead of posting the entire album, they just post a song here and a song there. So he started doing that with his stand-up, to where he posted a special and it did really well. So he started posting clips of him out on the road, and he's gone viral, and he's really set the bar for how comedians can use YouTube to leverage an international audience. And now he's touring the world, selling out everywhere. So he really showed us that it's possible. I personally have been using YouTube more to amplify my podcast. I'm a one-man band over here still. I'm open to building a team, but it's really just been kind of all me for the first 10 years of my career. So I have to really allocate my time and resources effectively. And right now the podcast is just getting the most momentum between my stand-up versus my podcast. So a lot of the podcast is still posting long interviews on there, but then also kind of like we talked about with comedians posting clips of their stand-up, I do the same thing with my podcast. I'll post the hour-long interview, but then also post the micro content to kind of funnel people into the entire channel.
I've seen that. Like Joe Rogan obviously does that to a huge extent, where he'll post like he'll be interviewing some celebrity or something, and they'll say something really insightful or shocking or something, so they'll just cut that one clip, and because they're in the studio together, it's just video of them talking to each other, but that clip might get hundreds of thousands or millions of views. A lot of YouTubers are doing this now. Like I'm thinking like the Logan Paul, the H3H3 podcast, like they're all doing it.
Right.
You would think that podcasting wouldn't translate very well to video, but it actually does. Like I've found myself watching these clips of podcasters. So does that mean that you try to do it in a studio, so that you can have it being filmed as you're doing it, or what is that? Because most of these are in-person interviews where I see this working.
Yeah, all of my interviews are in person, and I didn't start incorporating video until maybe I've been doing my podcast like 4 years. I probably didn't start doing video till maybe 3 years in, because it just adds a whole other workflow. It adds a whole other layer of work that needs to be done. But I have found, in all honesty, like people that start a podcast now, I'm like, I would start audio just to find your system. But video really adds a new dimension, and it adds a whole other like level of content you're able to share too. Because video is, in my opinion, video is the future. I was just at Podfest in Orlando this weekend, and they were talking about YouTube like it's the best social media platform. I looked at it as a search engine because it is the second largest search engine, but they were kind of pivoting as look at it like social media that has billions of people on it. And that really opened my eyes to, I really need to start paying more attention to YouTube and stop trying to get as many likes on Instagram. But I think YouTube is still untapped enough when you have your audience and your niche understood to where I think that's still the best place to build an engaged
And do you have an
audience.
example in which you posted a shortened clip to YouTube and it really took off?
Yeah, so I interviewed a comedian named Felipe Esparza, he's been on Comedy Central. I mean, you can Google him. I mean, he's done a lot of things, but what happened with I posted his full interview, and that's been doing well. I think his is now around about 40,000 views. But what really, really took off was I posted a clip of him talking about Gabriel Iglesias stealing one of his jokes, and that one's now over 400,000 views. So that's just one example of like a clip, and that's my biggest one as well. It's not like all of them are spiking like that, but that really opened my eyes to the potential reach a YouTube video can
But what
have.
did that do in terms of real like building your audience? Like, did you also notice a corresponding spike in like podcast downloads after that?
I noticed a spike in subscribers, and I noticed a spike in people looking at all my other content within my YouTube channel. But the actual the audio podcast, there was no
Interesting.
spike
Huh.
because it's like a separate
Audience.
it's almost like a yeah it's almost like a separate channel, a separate audience. So yeah, it didn't transfer all the way over to the audio, I would say, but definitely the YouTube has taken a big spike. And if I was more intentional about directing people towards, which moving forward, now that I'm starting to understand how YouTube works a little bit better and how to formulate your videos and things like that, I will start having more of a call to action to encouraging them to go subscribe on the audio
Mhm.
platforms, you know. But this was an interview I just kind of threw up, just not even understanding really the system behind YouTube. But the more and more I've been studying it, I know from now on I will be more proactive in encouraging them to, hey, we're also on iTunes or on Spotify. Go subscribe, and really having that call
And
to
you
action.
mentioned the downstream effect of it seeing more views. Like I've done that where I've gone down some rabbit hole where I discovered like Nikki Glazer's like roast, for instance, and then all of a sudden YouTube's algorithm just started showing me a ton of Nikki Glazer comedy stuff. Like, is that kind of the goal? Is if you can get one to go semi-viral, then the people who watch that will be recommended your other stuff and kind of go down that rabbit hole.
Exactly. Yeah, you really want to get on that suggested list to where when you're watching something, you see your video in the column next to it saying, hey, if you like this, you'll enjoy this other video. That's really the goal and how you get people in your
So I
ecosystem.
was just listening to a podcast interview with Jesse David Fox, who's the comedy podcaster and critic at Vulture, and he was saying he kind of pointed to the current comedy boom really being traced to Netflix, where they took the HBO comedy special, which was scaled a little bit by Comedy Central when they started doing comedy specials, but Netflix really scaled it to like a point where they were releasing a new comedy special like every single week. Do you think maybe Netflix plays the largest role in this huge boom in comedy?
Um, I would say so because they really seem to be like the biggest purveyor of comedy. Like they're the ones who have really been investing in just releasing specials. I won't say with anyone, but you can have all the way up to Dave Chappelle, all the way down to someone you've never even heard of, you know? So it's become a great platform for people to discover new comedians and get access to their favorite comics. And they're investing a lot of money over there. I think they're printing money
Yeah.
at this point. I don't know how they're doing what they're doing, but they may be on the Amazon model where it's just like, let's just keep burning through it until it pays off, which Amazon shows if you can survive all those years you're losing money, then you can actually dominate the industry.
Well, I think they see it as cheap content. Like, yeah, like a Dave Chappelle's getting like $20 million, but like a mid-list comic is getting far less than that,
Right.
and they get a good solid hours worth of content. Whereas if they're doing a whole TV show, like a scripted TV show, it's many multiples of that. So while the money they're throwing at the comedy space is big deal for the comedy space, it's actually they're probably their motivation is it's actually really cheap content compared to what it's costing them to produce just about Stranger Things or any of their other hits. I
Yeah.
would think.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense actually. Yeah, that's a good observation.
So you've launched your own startup special, but you're selling it yourself.
Hmm.
I know Louis C.K. kind of famously did that several years ago and saw a lot of success. How common is that? Is that like what was your motivation for trying to do it on your own?
Well, everything I've done in my career has been on my own. And I thought 10 years into comedy, this is my opportunity to really invest in myself and showcase all the work I've put in to the craft of comedy and really give an opportunity for my audience that exists now and new people to discover me. And there are comedians doing the self-produced route like me where you pay for everything yourself and just you pretty much just do it all yourself and then release it. And a lot of them are releasing it onto YouTube with the hopes of new people finding them and then building a fan base that then you can apply to sales tickets out on the road. And I've seen a lot of comics do that. So anything I'm looking for in decisions I make is I'm looking for like contradictions in trends. So if I'm seeing something, and this is all experimentation, so this could be, we'll see the end result of it. So far, I'm very happy with the sales. But if I see something that's working and that a lot of people are doing in my industry, I want to do the opposite of it and see if I can catch a new wave. Because I feel like if I'm seeing something done a lot, like you mentioned, you see comedians just posting clips of their stand up and they do the subtitle and the crazy heading. And then that's become like the formula. I'm always looking for like the next thing. Instead of riding a wave, I always want to try and find what's next. So with me, it was producing my own special, but then trying to sell it instead of trying to just throw it out for free and see what happens. So far it's really been paying off, and my intention is to really, like with my podcast, to inspire other comics to really start to take their career into their own hands and invest in themselves and create their own success, and
Well,
it's working.
well, what platform are you using? Because I'm guessing like your goals, the goal for that kind of thing is you want to remove as little friction or create as little friction as possible, so that they don't have to go, jump through hoops to try to get it. Like I don't think YouTube does it have anything where you can directly put something behind a paywall and sell it that way, or
um
what are you using?
I'm using a website called Gumroad, which is
Uh-huh.
it's like a social it's like a YouTube for creators, really, where you can sell your own content. And a friend of mine actually told me about it, where he sold his special on there, and he's already sold upwards of 20,000 copies of his special on there. So all I had to do was upload it on there, and then it embeds directly into my website. So the friction is completely gone. Like they just go to my website, and then the first thing they see is order the Trophy Husband comedy special, and then boom, they have it to download, or they can just stream it.
Well, I wouldn't say the friction is completely gone. Like but anytime you have to embed something on your own website and get them to go there, that's friction. I think the least friction would be if like YouTube actually rolled out a product, because 2 billion people are already on YouTube. So not having to leave that platform. Also, YouTube is already connected to their Roku's and Apple TVs and stuff like that. So that integration is already there. Where like how hard would it be for them to like watch it on their TV screen, for instance?
On their TV screens, I haven't had anyone with an issue with that. Yeah, I don't think the app is in Gumroad. I don't think Gumroad is on Roku or anything like that. I
Yeah,
think
so they'd
it's
have
all
to connect.
streaming and downloading. Yeah.
So they'd have to connect like using like like an HDMI cable for their laptop to the TV if they wanted to watch it on there.
Yeah, but luckily most people are on mobile and laptops now anyway. So I've only had a few people requesting DVDs, and they're people in my family. But I guess everyone else has really been watching it more via mobile or on their laptops.
Huh. And so how do you market something like that? Like, are you cutting up, like, are you taking like small clips from it and uploading it to YouTube? Like, what are the different ways that you can drive people to actually pay for it?
Yeah, I'm posting clips of it, like just giving little teasers here and there. I made a trailer for it as well, and I'm also doing a lot of podcasts, promoting it that way. And anytime I'm out at a show, I promote it, and I have like a QR code people can take a photo of that'll take them directly to the website as well. But it's been out, a little over a month now. So I can say out of everything I planned in terms of this project, the marketing was definitely my least looked at part of it, which I am, as we do in anything in life, it's all trial and error and lessons learned and just kind of figure it out as we go. So that was something I know moving forward, and something I'll advise other comedians wanting to do this, is to really invest the time and money into the marketing side of it. So I'm still not averse to investing in the marketing. If there is someone that's listening to this that is savvy in that space and thinks they can really help me get more momentum with it, a lot of the marketing right now has been via word of mouth, which is, it's good. And word of mouth has been the best way I've been able to grow my podcast to what it is. But I know there's more potential out there, but I'm open. I'm all ears too, Simon. If you know something, please share.
Well, I'm guessing you're benefiting from the fact that you have a podcast right now, in the sense of like, now that when you go and pitch comedians, they're like, oh yeah, I was on your podcast, so y'all let you come on my podcast to plug your comedy special, and that they're really hungry for that kind of content to be able to get you on.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
And then I'm guessing you're also plugging it during your stand-up as well, like your actual live stand-up.
Yeah, and getting my listeners to share it and support that way, and also order it. So I thought it would just be a couple of friends and family that ordered it at the beginning, but we really had a successful pre-sale, and I've already almost made back my money, which was really my initial goal with it to begin with, was to, if I can just break even on this project, then I'm happy with the results. But I think there are more savvy marketing tools I could be using to really, my whole goal with it was to really create a blueprint for other comedians to see, okay, this is how he shot his special, this is how he marketed his special, and this is how it was successful. So I've been able to break down the blueprint for how I recorded it and all the specs of that. But now the marketing side is something that it's still a little blurry in terms of, I don't think I'd be able to give a blueprint on what my marketing is just yet.
And is part of it like just kind of basically proof of concept, in the sense like, I can do a special, and so maybe your next big thing is a Netflix special or a Comedy Central special, because they can see that you've already done one, so they can say, okay, this is what it's going to look like when he does one for us.
For sure. Yeah, that was a big part of it as well, that it's evergreen content. So in 5 years from now, I'll still be making money on that special.
Okay, Joel, well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find your work online?
My website is joelbyerscomedy.com. I know it has a little more friction than YouTube, but it's worth it. But you can also subscribe to my podcast on all audio platforms, and also on YouTube as well. I have my own personal YouTube page where I actually posted vlogs of me preparing for my comedy special, if you're into the behind the scenes. But the best way to get my comedy special, just go to joelbyerscomedy.com, JOELBYARS comedy.com. It'll be the first thing you see. And it's called The Trophy Husband. My wife and dog make a cameo. I close on a joke my wife told me not to even do in the special. So it's really a labor of love. So go order it so my wife doesn't make me get a real job.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Simon.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast. So if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.